Hey, I'd like to welcome everybody out to another Eventus AI webinar. We're excited to have Matt Gantner, who is the managing principal from Altum Strategy Group, here today. And I had asked him to speak about software selections in uncertain times. So welcome, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Matt. I appreciate it.
No, I'm happy you're here. Obviously, and to go a little bit back, I've known Matt for many years, and I have asked him. We were having a conversation about the current state of what's going on with COVID-19 and the state of business, and we got talking around software selection on certain times, and so I thought, well, it would be good, if I do software, you really understand software. And so I thought it would be good to kind of talk through what does that look like, right? Now that things are you're juggling many balls, doing many responsibilities, business has changed, maybe supply chain has changed, your reliance on it has changed, all those things. You may be looking at stuff. So I'm happy to have Matt on today. So thank you for joining me.
No, thanks for having me. And I mean, all those things you hit on, I think, are top of mind for a number of companies we've spoken to recently. And people are really trying to figure out how do they entrench in their current investment. And others are thinking about how do I emerge from the pandemic in a different position than I am today. So we've seen a very interesting set of discussions across supply chain, across transformation, across finance, and even HR to really figure out what they should do to really plan for the future. So it's a great topic right now. It's very top of mind for a lot of executives out there.
It really is. I mean, there's a lot of ways I think people are really evaluating right now their transactions. What does it look like? Where does it come from? How can we improve it? It just seems to me that there's a lot of the overall marketplace has changed just a little bit, right? The need for the brick and mortar maybe has moved just a little bit. I know I've got a good friend who's the CIO at Sportsman's Warehouse, and they have seen this huge jump in their need. And shout out to Phil Stevens, who those guys are rocking and rolling, and so there's this need now of kind of evaluation. And so that was my premise. I was like, well, I got to talk to Matt, because Matt, if anybody knows, Matt knows, right? And his team over at Altum. So thanks for joining me. And I'd love for you to kind of give a little bit of bio. Maybe not everybody knows about you. I know you. And so maybe that's a good way to start out.
Yeah, sure. So again, thanks for having me today. So again, my name is Matt Gantner. I am the founder and managing partner for Altum Strategy Group. I've been in the consulting space for over 15 years. So I've helped a number of companies, anywhere from startup to large enterprise, really think through holistically, what are their challenges, and then really put together pragmatic and practical solutions for them to actually optimize or resolve those challenges while enabling them to scale for growth. So yeah, it's been a great career and a lot of fun along the way.
Yeah, that's awesome. Congratulations, Matt. Congratulations on your own firm. I know Matt and I worked together previously at another firm, and now he's branched out and taking that huge step. So congratulations. That's awesome.
Appreciate it, and to you too, especially with founding your own event company and putting all the technology that you've put into it in place.
It's kind of exciting times, right? And you think about it. I was reading something the other day about all the companies that had come out when the 2008 and 2009 downturn happened, right? And a lot of the great things that kind of came out of that. I think we're going to see here in about 5 or 6 years that a lot of companies have really, who really looked at it and were able to kind of work through some of the challenges that were out there in the marketplace, have really become really stable companies here, maybe 2025, 2026.
Yeah, agreed. Agreed.
So that's great. So I appreciate you taking the time to kind of chat with me. We'll continue on our discussion. Let's see. I can go over a little bit of kind of what we do. Eventus AI, we're obviously an event technology shop, right? Our whole goal is to personalize the journey. We recently came out, in fact, yesterday with our new widget, so ability to play retro games while you're waiting for a session to start. So in this case, you would have been able to play Space Invaders or Snake or Tetris before you logged into this Zoom meeting. Kind of some fun things that we're trying out right now as we're engaging. People are getting that kind of fatigue on Zoom. So, our goal is obviously to personalize the event journey or personalize the connection when you get on virtual events. At some point, we'll go back to live events. Woo! we'll be able to see everybody again, which will be nice. And I look forward to those days. So just a little bit about us. Anything that you would like to kind of share a little bit about Altum Strategy Group?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. So again, as I mentioned, Altum really helps companies anywhere from startups to large enterprise. And we really take a holistic approach across people, process, and technology. So as you can see, these are our 6 kind of major services, if you will, within the business. A good way to think about it and summarize it is really it's 4 major pillars. First pillar is helping companies with program management and digital transformation. So from software selection, which we'll be touching on today, all the way through to deployment. Our second major pillar is all around application security and your traditional governance, risk, and compliance, or the 3 lines of defense. Our third major pillar is digital asset management. So that's the classic data governance, classification, master data management. And then our last and final pillar is around business process design, optimization, and controls integration.
Awesome. Thank you. That's quite the list right there. And if you look at this kind of overview, now we'll kind of start getting into the meat of what I'd ask you to kind of talk about. Given the recent events in our business environment, social environment, you kind of have it right there with COVID-19. There are a lot of changes that are out there. How does somebody out there start looking at kind of their current events, globally, nationally, locally, right? And saying, okay, I'm seeing either opportunities, challenges that I could probably take advantage of either within my own company or outside that will allow me to either garner more market share, increase productivity, right? Look at incremental changes that may alter kind of their landscape. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And you hit on a couple of really interesting points that we've seen have a lot of variation as companies have started to kind of come out of COVID and really think about how are they going to re-enter the workspace? How are they going to, first and foremost, take care of their employees so their employees can take care of their customers? And really a couple of drivers to that is that you touched on it just very briefly there, is that the impact of COVID has impacted businesses differently, but more importantly, it's impacted local communities very differently, even within the same state, same country, same kind of overall geography within the world. So one key thing that we've been talking to a lot of companies about is think about your operating model as a whole, right? So top down, and then break that down into the pieces where your employees actually live and work, and really figure out what is working well kind of overall as a company, but then more importantly, drill down into what may not be working well in each of the respective local areas. So for example, in New York, we're in New York right now, we're in the process of reopening, and it's more of a cautionary reopen solution or approach than other parts of the country. So if you compare kind of what New York's doing to what, for example, Florida is doing, it's very much night and day, right? So Florida is at a point now where they're really kind of opening the doors and allowing people to get back to work and allowing schools to reopen and a number of things to take place. Whereas New York has, delayed the opening of schools, still has only 25% capacity for indoor dining. Yeah. And then now we're even considering putting some additional restrictions in place in areas that are actually seeing a spike in COVID. Right. So that really touches on kind of some of the unexpected consequences, right? Where we thought this would be more of a linear path to reopening, we're seeing this as really kind of peaks and valleys. And as a result of those peaks and valleys for people, that's having interesting, in some cases positive, in other cases negative impact for respective businesses.
Sure. And as you look at that, I know, excuse me, you and I have talked, many times about the kind of 3 pillars as you look for, new opportunities, new challenges to overcome in people, process, and technology, right? And how do you, when you come into a business environment, how do you go through that, especially right now where you may be asking people to be doing more work or different work or expand their knowledge base because, you may have more work or you may have less work. So depending on, if you have less people to do it. So there's a lot of things that happen. So how does a company come into it and go, okay, look, there may be some optimization here, but I'm not sure if it's on the process side. I'm not sure it's on the technology side. It may be the people side, right? How do you go through that process of being able to go, okay, here's the next step in our evolution of making sure we start to streamline this with somewhat of a vision. Does that make sense, Matt?
It does. It does. So let me put that. It's a great question. Let me respond to that in the context of kind of an assessment, and then kind of pivot and hit your other point on the technology side.
Okay.
So always, like, the first place we always like to start is let's gain an understanding of your business. So that can be done through a traditional kind of standalone assessment, or that can be done as part of a broader initiative, in this case, software selection.
Let me ask you a question. Can I stop you right there?
Yeah,
So,
please.
company, before they come to you, because I know you really know how to do this, right? This is your bread and butter. You guys are phenomenal at it. But if a company was just saying, okay, I think I've got little holes I'm starting to see, how do they self evaluate to the point where they're like, oh, yeah, it's a people, it's a process, it's a technology. And then that kind of leads them to you at Altum Strategy.
Yeah, um, that's a multifaceted challenge in a
I
way.
put you right on the spot, didn't I? Got you. I set you up and just socked you. Sorry, Matt. I mean, so
Oh,
what
it's
I'm really
okay.
looking for, if I've got some clients, I've got some friends who own some medium sized business, right? And they're
Yeah.
like, hey, there could be something here. There could be a benefit by updating my technology solution. I'll give you an example, right? I'm a small pharma company. I'm coming out with something that may help, let's just say COVID-19, right? And I've got to go through FDA regulations. There's Chapter 11, whatever it is, and maybe I choose SAP or I choose something that was going to help me, get to that point where I feel that my back end is fully aligned and compliant with all the regulations, regulatory bodies, things like that. How does somebody come to that point of saying, hey, it's now time to get off potentially QuickBooks and move over, or another platform and move over, right? And then come to you.
So what it comes down to is just, first and foremost, every organization is different. The people within those organizations is different. The level of maturity within those organizations is different. So to your initial question, what it comes down to is, how well does that organization perform when it comes to, quote unquote, looking in the mirror and really assessing kind of where their strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats are. And then, in some cases, organizations are really great at that, right? And that's what allows them to be market leaders and to continue to evolve and drive continuous improvement. In other cases, they just may not be as strong as that, given maybe they're a startup, maybe they're, in Series A, Series B funding, and they're just in growth mode, right? So that growth mode doesn't really allow them to take a look in the mirror, right? In your example on the pharma company, especially with the number of upstart pharma companies that we've seen in response to COVID, is a
Right,
good
right.
example of that, right? So in either case, there's certainly an opportunity for that company to have a discussion with us. So we can basically say, hey, where are you in your maturity? Where do you think your problems are? And then we can come in and perform kind of that independent assessment to really either, one, confirm, yeah, that understanding is correct, or B, you thought it was over here in, let's say, supply chain, but your actual problem is in sales, as an example. And then really help them tie that together either through training people or just enabling communication across multiple departments. It could be standing up a new process or optimizing existing process that they may have, or it could be to one of your examples, upgrading from QuickBooks to an SAP or another ERP solution
Right.
to really allow them to have that technology that supports their people and process. And that's more critical today than probably ever before in our history, at least our recent history, given that a lot of companies are pivoting towards a remote working model.
Yeah.
And that remote working model is going to stay in place for, arguably the foreseeable future, right? We just saw a recent study where, 73% of employees are very happy staying in that remote working model, sorry. So the likelihood that executives respond to that positively is pretty high.
Yep. No, I would feel so. So let's just say I'm a CIO, a VP of technology, VP of IT, and as I've talked with those within the organization, I feel that maybe there's some strategic initiatives that we could undertake that would allow us to, let's just say, capture revenue, fine tune our process improvement, right? Regulatory compliance, whatever it have you. You know, if I'm not that senior leader, could be director of technology, could be, you know, whatever. I guess the title's not that important, right? How do I go through that approach of identifying, okay, what's going to be my process to go through and verify that this is going to be beneficial throughout the, you know, for the company. How do I go, you know, what are my key deliverables going to be? What's my project plan going to be? You know, how am I going to go through this entire process and start to build out my hypothesis, you know, my theories on what's wrong, and then go through that analysis phase.
Yeah, great questions. Let me actually jump to the next slide. So let me just talk you through kind of our methodology and how we've helped, you know, a number of companies go through this journey. Really, it starts with kind of the project prep. So to your example of the CIO or CISO or COO or whomever,
Yeah.
you know, saying, hey, I think I need a new system, right? It could be as big as an ERP or an HRIS system. It could be as small as a GRC solution or a middleware component to just tie all my on-prem and my cloud solutions together. So first and foremost, the main thing is gaining understanding of the challenges as you understand them today in the project preparation phase, identifying your key stakeholders, building on an overall timeline, and essentially completing a project plan. From there, we would move into discussions with each of the respective business process teams. So let's say it's you know, it's finance, HR, procurement, and distribution, right? That all kind of need to provide input into this to-be solution.
Sure.
So we meet with each of those respective teams and capture their requirements of the current state, as well as what their future state needs may be, and then help them really think through that process.
Let me ask you a question there, because sometimes, and I haven't come across this, the companies don't always know their current state,
Yeah.
right? They don't know everything. They'd love to know everything. They know things work and the flow a little bit, but who owns what data? Where does it go? How does it look? Sometimes it can get a little bit messy, especially when you've brought in disparate systems, right? There's been an acquisition or something like that. You know, how does somebody start to come in and kind of evaluate even their current process to understand it, right? Where does the data go? Who owns it within the company? Stuff like that, especially for privacy, right? I mean, even.
Yeah, I mean, the first place we always start with companies that don't necessarily have a good understanding of kind of the end-to-end is actually just with a whiteboard, right? So we meet with the respective stakeholder groups and we say, hey, walk us through your process. And then what we'll do is we'll whiteboard that out. And then once we're done, we'll create process maps that we can then use to link various departments or functions together.
Yeah.
And once we really understand the full end-to-end flow, it's then going a level deeper and going to the data, right? So to your point on the data is a huge, you know, asset within companies that needs to be either, you know, looked at for privacy and protection reasons, or, you know, could potentially be monetized depending on your business and your industry, et cetera. So that's really the second piece, is then understanding the data flow that feeds that process and the inputs and outputs of that data.
So within that, as you take and you identify the process, next you identify the data, where it actually sits, when it's in motion, when it's in rest, things of that nature, right? What happens, who touches it, who has access to it. Then how do you come up, once you have identified that, how do you come up with that actual hypothesis of, okay, now I'm going to map this out. You know, I'm going to look at and start making business need identification, right? I'm going to take this and go, oh, this is a definite need, that this data, you know, can be used for this, right? Business intelligence, you know, analysis work, right? And kind of start with those initial requirements, right? How do you ultimately come up with, these are the 6 things that I think, and, you know, that I'm going to whittle them down to, these things are really important. Maybe I'm going to kick off with these 2. If I can get these 2 done, it would be really great with our organization. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. So let me touch on that here on the next slide in more detail. But let me just hit on a couple key things on this
Yep.
slide, and we'll move into that because I think that's a key point that I want to make sure we spend some time on. Is really once you get your requirements and we go through the hypothesis, which we'll touch on here in a second. The next thing is really make sure you build out a comprehensive RFP that the vendors are able to understand, which we'll go into in more detail here in a couple slides. And then it's going to be really important that you have a very strong scoring process for both the technology as well as your potential system implementation partner. So at a macro level, I just kind of want to tie up one of your earlier questions, Matt, that as a CIO or other executive, this is really kind of the end-to-end process. Now, diving deeper, really when you think of how do we really bring this to life when it comes to identifying requirements, building the hypothesis, et cetera, really think of it as 5 discrete steps. So the first step is really those initial requirements. So that's going back to what we were just talking about a second ago. That is the whiteboard process and really understanding how people are viewing their day to day. What systems do they interact with today? To your point, is it all within one system today or is it in disparate systems? Then you do aggregation through Excel as an example. Once we gain that understanding, we're able to then whiteboard that out, which is really key step number 2, to really put that um, delivered conversation learnings onto a whiteboard, build that out into a flow that makes sense, and iterate through that with the initial stakeholder group that we had met with, using finance as an example. Once we do that and we're able to get their sign off that, yeah, that business process flow does make sense, we're then able to take those current state needs, the business process as it is today, and help them reimagine those requirements to create the to-be requirements. So somebody may say, hey, in today's world, using a finance example, I don't have the ability to park and post a journal entry within my system.
Mm-hmm.
Today's world, I have to do this manual work here, and then I have to feed this system there, and then I have to do a review, and then I have to actually post that to the GL. So the to-be requirement would be, the system is enabled to streamline the park and post process for manual journal entry creation and approval, right? So that's a way we would start to take those initial requirements, rethink them, and then in parallel to that, step 4 is really finding those additional efficiencies. So staying on the park and post, if we migrate that all to one system versus, let's say, 2 systems in today's world, that's certainly going to drive time efficiencies, but it's also going to drive system workflow triggers that are going to make it more streamlined for the reviewers and the approvers to perform their appropriate control, review, sign off, and certification of financial statements.
As you're going through this, how fluid is this? You've got your initial requirements, right? Your initial hypothesis of what you need done. You start to map it out, like you said, on the whiteboard. And then when you get into kind of those requirements, as you start to move through that requirements phase and you're finding all these efficiencies and enhancements, does the thing start to, does the project have a little bit of life to it? Meaning, hey, this is what we found is we've got more data, more understanding. Do you find that people kind of get more, not enlightened, but understanding that they can use to maybe fine tune the project? Is there a point where they really start to fine tune, or is there that kind of little bit of fluidness so it's not as rigid? Hey, I wanted to get this done. I need to get this done, but we found in the process that you mentioned that maybe sales was having an issue, that we had to resolve that before we could move forward to how we record this, because the way sales was entering it into the system may have been incorrect based on what our finance team need. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the requirements, which is really the business need identification, by far is the longest single module or process or phase within the software selection journey, because it does become iterative, right? So you may say, hey, finance is doing it this way, to your point, and as a result, that's going to solve their needs, but it actually creates problems for sales or vice versa. So how do we go back and make sure that the to-be requirements are aligned to solve that problem as much as we possibly can? And then really, as we get into kind of the later portions of the software selection journey where we're going through those demos, actually illustrating what the needs of sales are versus what the needs of finance are, and then really having those open and honest conversations with the stakeholders, bringing them back to the requirement to really make sure that that solution fits their needs. So absolutely, I mean, the best way to think about this is a very agile
Yeah.
phase within the overall journey, and it's often the most critical, right? Because you have to at least frame up your problem, frame up what those solutions potentially, may be, and then really work to align the team to those solutions that are really a win-win for kind of multiple parties within either a department or across a business.
Okay, that's great. One quick question, and through this, I've seen when we have done something of this nature, we had somebody start out, and they may have been a part of the initial requirements, a little bit of part of the mapping, and then the to be requirements and finding the efficiency they may not be a part of, and then you kind of bring them back in when you have to align the team, right?
Mm-hmm.
How key is it for anybody within this process? Let's just say you're director of PMO and you're leading this process right throughout to have continual communication, because sometimes I see that there's some bump in the road when you start bringing the team back into a line and things have been fluid. There's been an agile development through this, an agile piece, should we say. And so they've moved just a little bit. And so when people come back into a line, they're like, well, I didn't think we were doing that based on the requirements that I set 3 months ago, 4 months ago, we were doing X. And so when you bring them back in, they're a little bit frustrated because they had voiced their opinion, concerns, knowledge at the very beginning 4 months ago, and now things have changed. How can somebody in that PMO, facet really help to make that aligning the team easier for when they bring them back into that backside?
Yeah, it's a great question. So typically, just in terms of duration, we typically don't like to see requirements or business need identification take, more than 6 to 8 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
The reason being is exactly to your point, right? If you capture somebody's requirements 4 months ago, the odds that they're going to remember the requirement, even if they may have signed off on it, via email, call it 2 months ago,
Yeah.
the odds that they're going to remember that is pretty low. So that's where it's really important to kind of really maintain a very tight timeline around the requirements
So,
definition phase.
Matt,
And
are you telling me that if I sent you an email 2 months ago, you're not going to remember that one email that I sent you at that one time 2 months ago?
I mean, it depends on I guess, but
Yeah, that totally makes sense, right? I mean, if you do that sign off so long ago and then you come back in your mind, sometimes you think, oh, this is what I said, and it's tough to remember. Yeah, that's great.
yeah,
That's a great point.
yeah. And then
Um,
in terms of the communication, it's really making sure you have those standing, weekly status meetings and inviting the appropriate number of stakeholders, but also make sure that even if they're not part of the standing status meeting, they are receiving, a minimum of a weekly communication on status. Where are we? What's the full set of requirements? Where can I find those, be it on a SharePoint site, a Google Drive, or, email? So,
yeah. So that constant update, at least maybe not every day in the Scrum meeting. We use the word agile, so I'll just throw out the Scrum meeting, right? In our daily conversations, they may not be involved. But if you can have that regular cadence where you communicate out, then I think people feel a part of the process and can understand maybe why, people, why they moved, right? But if you said, hey, I'm going to move, an inch every week, if you come back in 6 months, you've moved a couple feet, which may be a big deal for people, right? But if you see kind of incremental movements every week, you're like, oh, that's not, I can see how they got there, if that makes
yeah,
sense.
absolutely.
That's great. So as we talk about, and let's bring it back to kind of the uncertain times, right? So how does that drive us in the decision making to say, okay, we've identified, our basic plan, but in a normal environment, I know how to proceed. In
Mhm.
this time of uncertainty, I don't know if we're going to continue this way, if we're not going to continue this way. I've got a big push on my supply chain. Is that going to continue? Is it not going to continue? Right? In these uncertain times, how do you start to address those questions? In fact, I see you threw that up. Thank you. You're psychic. You knew. So how does that come out when you factor in the uncertainty? Because that kind of makes you want to pause, right?
Yeah.
And And I don't think you need to, but I think you have to be cognizant of it, right?
Yeah, I think the first thing to acknowledge, is you're not alone, right? So we're all going through very uncertain times, the likes of which, again, we haven't seen in our generation. Number one. Number two, it's really important to kind of remain calm, right? I think that's something that people, especially now, given the current, economic climate, political climate, cultural climate, you know, have to remember is that we all have to kind of remain somewhat calm. And the reason that I want to highlight that is because through uncertainty, the the best way you're going to get through it is if you really focus on what's right in front of you, but also you're looking out at kind of the horizon and really understanding what's to come, right? So,
So are
go
you
ahead.
saying, hey, let's have project plan 6 months, 3 months, 6 months, and then our overall vision of 5 years, right?
Yeah.
Short, medium term, long term. Is that kind of what you're alluding to? Just to make sure that I can understand.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have to think big picture and then break it down, right? So when you go from kind of the macro level of that forward-looking plan as a business, right? As a business, you should have your operational financial goals, looking out at least 3, if not 5 years into the future. And then from there, you can really kind of pare it back to what are the things that are going to enable you to get to that 5-year plan or the 3-year plan or the 10-year plan, again, however far out you're forecasting.
So let me ask you a question. So I get to a point where I'm going to do a 3 month plan, a 6 month plan, and a 1 year plan just right now, right? In my 3 month plan, I will figure out that we will maintain the same current environment
Yeah.
that we have right now. In 6 months, I may make two process plans, one with the same current environment and one where I see, maybe an ability for people to come back into brick and mortar store or people to congregate,
Yeah.
right? And for a business movement. Do you think it's wise now for us to kind of come up with multiple plans based on, hey, if we are seeing this on a regular basis, this cadence, then I can choose this because we already have the plan performed. So is it a good time to put multiple plans further out? How does that look?
Yeah, it really depends. Going back to what we touched on before, it really depends on your business specifically. So in some cases, like if you look at the way that technology, Zoom's a great example, right? They have seen an unprecedented growth rate through the pandemic due to remote users and companies having to adopt tools like Zoom, like Team, like GoToMeeting, etc. I think in other cases, if you look at kind of restaurant retail that arguably took one of the hardest hits
Yeah.
from COVID, they're in a much different position, right? So for them, they're looking at it not necessarily as even a 3 month plan, they're looking at it as a month to month plan right now and forecasting out 12 months and just trying to figure out how do I, keep myself going through the fall with outdoor dining. And then how do I continue to keep that going through, the winter and, the early, spring season, if you will, while it's still cold to enable me to not only bring customers in, but also ultimately to generate revenue to keep myself and my teams going.
So
So
would you think, Matt, this is where you take your own individual companies or industries metrics, and then you take those metrics of what you think that are going to happen, and then you start building out those requirements based on your company, your industry, the current environment, things like that. So you can make those requirements more meaningful, more that are more focused, laser focused in on kind of what you're doing and as a company, as a business right now.
I think what it comes down to is it's important to understand your industry for sure. It's important to understand what regulatory requirements are needed within your space. Are you a public company or your private company? Those considerations. I think they are inputs to your requirements for sure.
Okay.
But I think in terms of making them laser focused, they really need to be laser focused for your business because you could be in the same industry with, and you could, be across the street from your competitor. And what your competitor is doing to make the exact same product is different than what you're doing. But what is governing both of you could be a regulatory requirement, like you touched on earlier, FDA, right? So it could be an FDA compliance requirement, and that is applicable to both of you. So understanding how the competitive landscape looks is very important. Understanding how the regulatory environment looks is very important. But the piece that cannot be overlooked in this is how does your business operate and what are the nuances that are key to your business that make your business unique, right?
Yeah.
And that's where having those requirements be, to the point and really clear in terms of what makes you different versus a competitor is really important for software companies to look at as part of that RFP response.
Okay.
Really be able to get their arms around it quickly. Two, it's important to focus on incomes. We touched on earlier kind of that current state versus reimagined to be state. So what do you want to be in 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, to your point about those plans? What do you want to be as a company, and how do you want your company to look, and how do you want to leverage your people and deploy them strategically? Those are some of the key things that you want to consider as part of that. And then also it's important to be realistic,
Yeah,
especially.
that's good. My next thing is you say all these things, but how do you actually get to where it's, hey, this is a real requirement, right? This is really us, and this is the right thing for us, as opposed to, oh, sure, we'd love to be $100 million company. We're only 25, and we're going to do it in 3 years, but realistically, given the environment, this is what we can do, and this is the process would help us, improve shipping by 7% or something like that. So how do you get to that realistic point?
Yeah, it really comes down to 2 points we touched on briefly before. Is one, really making sure you have a good understanding from the strategic level, so call it the C level, if you will, of where they want the company to be in the next 5 to 10 years in terms of headcount, revenue, product, whatever those metrics are that are unique to that business. And then also aligning with the delivery team, the managers, the directors that are actually kind of hands on the keys, driving the business along kind of on a day-to-day basis, and making sure that the strategic and kind of the tactical really are aligned. And then where there's a misalignment, it's really important as part of our kind of role to really make sure that we bring those parties to the table to have those open and honest conversations and to facilitate those conversations, because these conversations can be difficult, again, depending on the business maturity of the company. So it's really important to facilitate that conversation to really make sure that people are on the same page. People are essentially looking at the same sheet of music and playing to those notes, right? And to your example, yeah, I want to be $100 million company in 5 years, but realistically with COVID, who knows? Maybe you're back 50% of that, so maybe you're $50 million in 5 years. Who knows? But those are the types of conversations that you need to have, and more importantly, in all those conversations, you can't forget that people matter. So you can have the fanciest, most expensive system in the world, but if you don't have the right people that are executing the processes within those systems and executing the processes around those systems and in control of those systems, you're going to lose control of your investment, and you're not going to necessarily see the return that you had hoped for.
So how do you make sure that those people have a voice, right? How do you do that?
Yeah. So, the way we always like to approach it is we want to bring everybody into the discussion. So we've seen companies that have made a software decision, just in IT alone, right? So IT said, hey, I want to go get this system, and they don't really think of the change management impact that it will have on other areas within the business. And we've seen those projects fail, right? We've had to come in and help, clean up a number of those projects. So it's really important to make sure that you identify not only what are the key requirements, but you also make sure you identify the right stakeholders, right? And those stakeholders should be a cross-functional group. Earlier we used the example of finance, sales, demand planning, and materials management. So for example, in that case, you want to make sure all of those stakeholders are at the table, excuse me, at the table from the outset, where they're able to provide their input to the requirements, and they're able to vet those requirements, and they're able to align on those. Because if you can get those folks at the table at the beginning, this next piece, which is scoring, becomes easier,
Okay.
right? Now, because I have everybody at the table from the beginning, everybody's looking at each other and saying, yeah, I provide that requirement makes sense, that requirement aligns to what you need in another department. let's start ranking those, and making sure we understand which one's most important and which one's least important and which is nice to have.
Is
And then,
this where you start seeing in the metrics and the scoring that it may move just a little bit based on once you start to score things out and you put out those metrics that it may go, oh, I didn't know how important this was to finance. Where for me it was a 2, for them it's a 10,
yeah,
and for something else that we were both like maybe 4s, where I would have put that more important. Now we see that it's really more important for finance that we do it this way based on this criteria.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. This is where you really start to, as you get into the weighting of the scores, and kind of loading those out by department or by requirement set, you'll see those moves, right? And you'll start to see people say, okay, I'm willing to give here for the betterment of X department, right?
Okay.
And you start to see people really begin to really assess, is that a must-have requirement or is it a nice to have? And which of these two kind of must-haves is a greater need for the business today versus which one of these must-haves is a greater need for the business longer term. And then you can really say, okay, let's attack those things that are low-hanging fruit right now that give us the greatest return, and then let's roadmap out, in 6 months or 12 months,
Yeah.
turning on this additional piece of functionality or enabling this process or hiring on this person or set of people to support an area.
So this sounds really great. And while they're doing this, they also have to do their current job, right? And what they're paid to do on a daily basis. How have you helped companies? What I would say is get a little bit of clarity, or kind of be able to mute the noise that happens on a regular basis within the company, to kind of get that clarity to make, okay, this is ultimately the decision that we're going to make. This is how we're going to listen to those who are helping us via demos or via other things. How do you help companies kind of mute the noise and find the clarity?
Yeah. So once you kind of align on metrics, then it really gets into the noisy part of the process. So once you have the metrics, you have all the RFP responses, now you're going into the software solution demonstrations. So the first thing is really making sure that you start with the organization's key stakeholder calendars. So meaning, like, if you have a demo with finance, you want to make sure that from CFO down, there's a day or set of days that work better for them. And then you present that back to the software provider for kind of a window for them to come on site, or virtual in this case, to do some demonstrations. So by starting with the stakeholders and their respective teams, you're able to clear their calendar essentially, and really make sure that you have the sponsorship from the top to allow them to focus in these demonstrations, so that, one, they really understand what the solution can do, and then two, they're able to ask any questions that may be top of mind, or maybe things that they've been thinking about but haven't had the opportunity to ask of that vendor. So
Sure.
by doing that, you're able to really lean into that decision. So what
So
we
let me ask you a question right there, and this is very pertinent to our time right now, with Zoom fatigue.
yeah
So how do you keep things? Let's just say we're choosing a new financial package, right? As part of our ERP, maybe overall package, right? We're going to look at what the financial would look like, and how do we keep it from, there's 15 vendors who want to do a demo, and each one, how do we pare that down? How do we, keep from having fatigue? So everybody looks at the first one, you may be like, I'm all excited. The second one, I'm really excited. By third, you're like, okay, this is great. It looks good. How do you keep that momentum so you can adequately judge across, let's just say, 4 main vendors, right? You're choosing 4 or 5 to actually come in, right? How does that work? Is, let's say you're a director of PMO, you're going to have, a CFO into 4 or 5 main, meetings, and it maybe have to be spread out over 2 weeks because you can't fit everybody in, within a 3-day time period, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, as part of the scoring, that's where, whenever we worked with companies, the largest set of vendors we ever looked at was 15. And we pared that down before we got to the demo stage down to 4. So that's why having those requirements and then having those key metrics is important,
Mhm.
because you don't want to bring 15 solutions into the demonstration phase.
Right.
You want
That's a
to
lot, right?
you want to keep it to three, no more than four
Yeah.
max, right?
Yeah.
And then at that point, especially, if we were back in the office, that would be a defined set of 2 days, let's say, where we're having those demos, and with various groups coming in and out of those demos over the course of those 2 days. In the world of Zoom now it's really breaking those demos out by group and really having more of a focused hour and a half session per group, and then having a daily kind of recap at the end of the day with the broader group, so the broader group can understand the feedback from the more targeted group sessions. So
So you're saying potentially set up breakouts, right? Maybe have one main session and have other breakouts where finance and supply chain would go and hear things that are pertinent to them, being able to bring back everybody back in at the end of the day and go, okay, how did this rank against? And then that's when you pull up the metrics and the key, from the key stakeholders and kind of go, okay, hey, look, this is the metrics, this is the scoring we use. Now we can start to judge that realistically against it.
yeah,
Okay.
absolutely.
Well, Matt, you've got some phenomenal experience and understanding about that. And if somebody wanted to come and said, okay, look, I like what Matt's saying. Ultimately, how do I now make the decision, right? Because we've gone through the score and we've gone through everything. Matt, now I need to make a selection, right? I need to get everybody aligned. We need to do it without bias, which would probably be very hard, right? Because we all have our internal jobs we have to do, and I'm biased toward that, right? I have to get A to be done, right? And I want the thing that makes me help get A to be done the best, right? And so how do you align that at the end?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's where so when you think of the scoring approach, it gives you two quantifiable data points, right? The first is scoring the vendor's RFP response.
Mm-hmm.
Second one is scoring the vendor's demonstrations. And the third one is a qualitative score. So it's soliciting feedback from key stakeholders and then essentially paraphrasing what they're saying. So it's not a direct quote, and then being able to show to kind of the leadership team as well as the broader stakeholder group, hey, this is what the scores were by application.
Yeah.
This is where they were adjusted based on your weighting, because don't forget that weighting is key now as you make that final decision. So you have your raw score, which is a per person score. That per person score then gets bounced up against the weighting criteria. So now you have a raw score to a weighted score. You have qualitative feedback, and then certainly, and not least by any means, but certainly lower on the list, you have pricing, right?
Yeah.
So that kind of gets you to the key data points that you're then able to take into a discussion to really talk about the merits of one solution over another, and based on and really having that discussion by removing emotion, because you're able to focus on the data, right?
So with what you're saying right here, how long should this take? This final step, right? We've had the demos, we've got the scores, we all go into Zoom room, right? And then we talk through this process. I'm guessing the longer it is between the demos and the longer it takes to get everybody in the room, the tougher it is potentially to make a decision. How key is it to getting this while it's still new in people's minds and understanding to kind of finish out the process?
Yeah, we like to help companies make the decision within 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the number of follow-ups that come out of demonstrations.
Okay.
So if there's very few follow-ups, we try and knock those out in 1 to 2 days, the following week after that demonstration. If there's a number of follow-ups, we'll probably have another kind of breakout session with that specific process area or department to kind of go deeper in that. But historically, we haven't let the decision go anywhere past 2 weeks because it
So
would be top of mind.
what would you say is the total time frame on average? You can't say for each company because each company is different, right? But if you were to give a ballpark for, a medium-sized company, $100 million, looking for a new ERP, hey, I know I just threw all that out to you, but what would you try to shoot for?
Yeah, I mean, you're typically looking at on the kind of the fast side, you're looking about a 10 to 12 week um, selection journey with all the follow-ups, with all the thought that goes into making that type of decision, because it's a multi-year decision, right? It's not a decision you're going to make now and then you're going to do this again next year.
Yeah.
It's a decision that you're going to have to live with for the next 3, 10 plus years, um, as you put more and more of your business within that platform. And the longest we've ever seen, and this was again going back to that company that had 15 different solutions that we were considering. That was a 6-month selection, just given how many vendors and how much due diligence and how many requirements, et cetera, we needed to build out for that specific company. So that is definitely an outlier. So again, on average, you're looking at 10 to 12 weeks.
Okay, that's wonderful. Now I've got 2 questions for you. We got 2 questions from our chat, and so I just wanted to make sure that I asked these. What is the right size for the stakeholder team to go through the selection process given the remote workforce?
Yeah, really great question. I mean, I think that you're still, just as if we were in the office, you'd want to make sure you had all the right stakeholders across each of the respective departments. So to quantify that is a bit difficult because every company is a little bit different in terms of size and scope. But on average, if you think about the number of stakeholders that are involved, it could be anywhere between 10 to 40 different stakeholders. I would say probably the average size is somewhere between 15 to 20 different stakeholders that are involved. So even in the world of Zoom, you're going to have that big stakeholder group together on a somewhat frequent basis, but really who you're really going to be engaging with most is specific subgroups within that larger group that focus on each of the respective business process areas within that company.
Okay. So ultimately now we jump back into the uncertainty. Somebody asked, when should an organization begin the process? Should they wait until some of the uncertainty with the current events are resolved, or just jump in now?
Going back to what we talked about, each business kind of being a little bit different, I would say there's 2 camps to that. One is the first camp is really those that are looking at software as a potential tool to help them emerge from the pandemic and really emerge and become a market leader, right? So not just kind of coming out of it in kind of business as usual, but really coming out strong. So we've seen a lot of companies that want to come out of this not only better, but also kind of moving into that market leader quadrant, really make heavy investments in technology to really make sure that they're going to be scalable for the longer term. Okay. On the other side of that, we've seen companies that have had to really entrench because their industry has just gotten hit so hard by COVID, where really their technology investment is to shore up what they have, and then where there's some money that is going to drive the greatest return, use that to enhance specific areas of their business and specific tools within those key areas that are going to help them kind of not only sustain but grow at a respectable rate coming out of the pandemic.
So what you're saying is, even though there is uncertainty, you can look for some clarity within that to go either way, right? Well, good. Well, I appreciate that. And as I look at the time, you were like 59 minutes with questions, Matt. You did extremely excellent. I'm proud of you to get that in. Well, I appreciate your time. Obviously, thank you to those at Altum Strategy Group. I appreciate you guys talking with me as I kind of share this with some of my friends who obviously own startups like myself, who've been a couple of years in and who are starting to grow and facing some of the uncertainty of a software selection in this time of uncertainty. So I appreciate you taking the time. And if somebody wants to reach out to you, oh, there it is right there. If somebody wants to reach out to you, this is how they get in touch with you. Just email you or call you or connect.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you having us joining you here today, Matt, and appreciate the time. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.